To finish up with the introduction and the background of the book so that we can actually begin to get into the book itself and try to see if it can just kind of come alive and really begin to appreciate the writings that we find contained in the book of Revelation. And we pointed out during the we pointed out during the other couple of classes that there are really three things that we can use to serve as keys to help us in understanding the book of Revelation. The first thing that we talked about is that we need to know the time in which the book was written and for what time the book was written. And so we've spent a couple of classes looking at that. Now what we want to do this evening, we want to look at the other two keys that are going to help us understand the book. Now we've got to learn of those who first received the book. Now we dealt with that a little bit. We talked about those Christians who were being persecuted by the Roman government during the first century, and that even led into several years after that. But directly, to whom is the book written? Say again? That's right. The book is addressed actually to the 7 churches of Asia, or Asia Minor, which would be modern-day Turkey, not Asia as we think of Asia today, China, Japan, and such as that. What you see, write in a book and send it to the 7 churches which are in Asia, to Ephesus, to Smyrna, to Pergamos, or Pergamum as some translations say, to Thyatira, to Sardis, to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea. Those are the ones that were the first recipients of the book. Now I'm going to put a map up here and kind of give you an idea of the location of these churches. Smyrna, Ephesus, Laodicea, Philadelphia, Sardis, Thyatira, and Pergamum are there in the region of modern-day Turkey or in Asia. Now, I want to point out something to you. Those were 7 literal churches that were actually in the area. But if you read the book of Acts, you're going to find that there was also a church at Troas that was in Asia. There was also the church at Colossae that was in Asia that are not mentioned as being recipients of the book. And there were probably other churches in Asia that are not recipients of the book. Now, why do you think that it's only sent to 7 churches and not to all the churches in the area of Asia? Any thoughts about that? Richard? Okay, now Richard mentioned something about numerology as it would be applicable at that particular time, and I think he's absolutely right. One of the things that we need to do in understanding the book of Revelation is kind of get a handle on the way that numbers are used in the book of Revelation. Remember, we're talking about symbolism. We're talking about signs, and so the numbers are not going to necessarily represent that which is literal, although there were 7 literal churches. The numbers are often used in a symbolic way. I want to put a quotation up here by a man by the name of Ray Summers, who wrote, this is one of the first commentaries that I ever had on the book of Revelation, and it's interesting that he's actually a Baptist. And he's got an excellent commentary called Worthy is the Lamb, and on page 21, Summers said, in that early day, when language was primitive and the vocabulary meager, one Hebrew word sometimes was compelled to do duty for a score of diverse meanings. Under such conditions, men came naturally to use numbers as we use words. They were the symbols of moral or spiritual truth. A certain number would suggest a definite concept. And that's especially true in the book of Revelation. Now think just for a moment, let's go through some of these numbers. The number one in the Bible often suggests that which is unity. Man and woman upon marriage become one flesh. One is used there in the sense of united or unity. That number is not actually found in the book of Revelation, but it just kind of gives you an idea. 2 is a number that represented strength. 2 is better than 1, or 2 may be worse than 1. Remember that when you get over into Revelation chapter 11, because we're going to be introduced to 2 witnesses. And so sometimes we spend a lot of time, okay, who are these two witnesses? Was it Moses and Elijah? Remember, we're using numerology here. We're using figurative language. 2 represents something that's better, the strength of the witness. 3 is a number that represents that which is whole, that which, for example, complete. Peter denied the Lord 3 times. Jesus endured 3 temptations. He was in the tomb 3 days. All prayed 3 times for the thorn to be removed. And the Godhead consists of 3. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Thus, not only is it a word that suggests that which is whole or complete, but that which would be divine. 4 is a cosmic number. That symbolizes the whole world or creation. We often sometimes use that term, talking about the 4 corners of the earth, totality of it, or the 4 winds, and that's a cosmic number. So keep that in mind when you talk, when you see the that which is unleashed from the 4 winds and so forth and so on like that. Keep in mind we're talking symbolism here. That would be a cosmic number. 5 is an incomplete or a short time. Now that's very important to remember, because we can't get literal on this. John tells us that the locust will hurt men for 5 months in chapter 9, verse 5 and 10. And so, that doesn't necessarily mean from January to May or whatever. It's figurative language. It simply means a short time. God's going to let this happen for a short period of time. 6, please don't forget this. 6 at this particular time would have been a sinister number, much like our number 13. It's a number that would suggest evil, or it's a number that fell short. It's a number that didn't measure up. It's a number that suggested failure. Very often it would be in contrast with that which was divine, which is, we'll look at another number here in a moment. But we need to remember that when we get over to Revelation chapter 13 and we see the number 666, the mark of the beast that's referred to there. It's a number, and in that time, and in that reference, it's used 3 times, whole, complete, and this is a sinister or a failed number. It's the number of man, not the number of God. So that's important to remember when we get there. 7 is a perfect number, and that's why the 7 churches, 7 spirits, 7 lampstands, 7 seals, 7 bowls, etc., etc., etc. It's a perfect number. 10 is similar to that. It's a fullness. Remember in Revelation 2 and verse 10, some are going to be tempted for 10 days. Some are going to suffer for 10 days. The totality of their suffering. 12 is a religious number in both the Old and the New Testament. It usually refers to God's people, the 12 patriarchs, the 12 apostles. And so when you see that, and you see it multiplying in the book of Revelation, you'll see 12 times 12, 144, or 144,000. So you got to keep that in mind. You're dealing with symbolism. You're not dealing with that which is literal in the book. And 3.5 is perfect 7 cut in half. And you're going to find it used in the book of Revelation as time, times, and half a time. 3.5. Or 42 months. Or 1,260 days. And so this is important for us to remember as we get into the book. So you may want to kind of keep in mind the use of numbers in the book of Revelation and not be tempted to want to literalize these numbers. What's these numbers saying to us? How are they being used? And keep in mind how that we've looked at them here, how they were being used. Now let's look at the letters to the 7 churches. Or let's think for a moment of the lampstands. Thyatira, Pergamos, Smyrna, so forth and so on. Chapter 1 shows us the John sees a vision of Christ among the lampstands. Well, what is this suggesting to us? This is how the book starts. What's this suggesting? Christ among the lampstands.
They started out doing what he wanted.
Okay.
He agreed with what they were doing for that point.
Well, now he has some condemnation for some of them. Listen.
We belong to
Okay, the churches belong. We as Christians and collectively as a church, we belong to Christ.
Well, the lampstands represented the churches. Christ being among them, he knows what's going on. He's among the churches. He's not somewhere else and not aware of what's going on.
Not detached. He's not absent. That's right. He is aware of what's going on. He is, as a matter of fact, in every single letter, Jesus will say to them, I know your works. Because he is among. That's the vision that John wanted these people to see. Immediately as he goes into the letter, Christ is among the lampstands. And we can learn from that Jesus, of course, is the chief shepherd. He inspects and he sees all that's going on. I know your works. But these 7 churches, while there may have been more in Asia, and there certainly were, I believe they properly represent the various conditions that may be found in any congregation, in any century, and in any year. What you see going on at Pergamum, or what you see going on at Laodicea, there are things that you're going to see perhaps in every local congregation, or many local congregations, that existed at any time. And that's true with us. Jesus inspects us. He sees both individually and collectively what we are about. And just as he says to the church at Ephesus, I know your works, I see your works, he says, in essence, to the church at Danville, I see your works. I know those among you who are strong. I know those among you who are weak. I know those among you who are lukewarm. Just as he did in those churches at that particular time. And so you see, while it has a time setting, there are also certainly some beautiful applications that we can make. But the third thing that we need to recognize, and this is one of the most important things as we study the book of Revelation, that we must recognize the uniqueness of the book. The book of Revelation, as far as the New Testament is concerned, is different from any other book in the New Testament. You know, sometimes we do this, and I've done it myself, and I think it kind of tends to lend itself to a little misunderstanding. We want to break the New Testament down into, you've seen it, the bookcase with the Gospels, then the book of history, the book of Acts, then we have the epistles, and then we have the book of prophecy, which categorizes it into 4 terms. I think that suggests something that is often unclear when we try to study the book of Revelation, because the book of Revelation, while it contains some prophecy, is not your typical book of prophecy. Now, in the Old Testament, there are some books that are written, at least portions of them, very similar to the book of Revelation. The book of Zechariah, parts of the book of Isaiah, parts of the book of Daniel. There's little smatterings in the book of Joel, and some other Old Testament books that contain some of the same writings that we find in the book of Revelation. But the book of Revelation is unique as far as the New Testament is concerned. Now let's think about how the book begins. And go ahead and get your Bibles open, because we're going to be looking at some verses here in just a moment. Actually, the first 5 words of the book is the revelation of Jesus Christ. And by the way, make note that revelation does not have an S on the end of it. It is not plural. It is the revelation, not the revelations of Jesus Christ. That word revelation keys us in on the uniqueness of the book. That word revelation translates a Greek word that is apocalypsis. Apocalypsis. Now, that's the same word from which we get the word apocalypse. And that's a word that we often hear bantered about, movies about the apocalypse. We hear about something that's very ominous, you know, the apocalypse, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. But what's apocalypse mean? Yeah, that's exactly it. Apocalypse does not mean Armageddon. Apocalypse does not mean the end of the world. I don't care what Hollywood says. That's not what apocalypse means. Nor does apocalypse always mean doom and despair. That's not the meaning of the word. Sometimes there's doom and sometimes there's despair that's revealed. But that's not what the word apocalypse means. Apocalypse, as was suggested, means an unveiling. That's all in the world that apocalypse means. It means an uncovering or an unveiling. So what Jesus says as he begins this book is this is the unveiling. I'm unveiling some things. As we said before, I'm pulling back some curtains here and letting you see some things behind the scene. I'm making some unveiling. But it is a very unique type of unveiling. It is what is referred to as apocalyptic literature. Now, like I said, there's some books in the Old Testament that contain some of the same kind of writings. I asked you on the worksheet that served as really one worksheet for 3 lessons here to define genre. What does that mean? What does genre mean? Say again? Yeah, a classification, a kind, a type of something. And so let's think about it as a kind. Revelation is a different kind of book. And it's a book that we don't handle like we do all other books. Let me illustrate that this way. Let's think about genre as far as movies are concerned. You often hear about movie genre. You know, you have your westerns, and you have your dramas, and you have your romance movies, you have your chick flicks, and all these other kinds of movies. So if you're watching, let's say, an action movie, there's certain things that you expect from that action movie that you don't expect when you're watching a romance. You just don't expect it. You don't expect when, you know, if you're watching a chick flick, you don't expect, you know, some ninjas to come out and start. You don't expect that. Because you watch the movie differently. Now, I'm going somewhere with this, so you hang with me. You know, you don't watch a western the same way that you watch a war picture. You know, there's different genres. And you watch them differently because of the type of movie that it is. The same is true with books. You don't read a nonfiction like you read a children's story or like you read a cookbook. You just don't read them the same. They're different genres. You know that going in. And if you tried to read a cookbook like you would, you know, The Hunt for Red October, you'd be lost as a dog in high weeds. It just wouldn't make any sense, you see. And the same is true with music. We have various genres of music. And you don't listen to music. You know, there's certain types of music you listen to one way. Some types you listen to another way. You just recognize the difference. And that's what we've got to do with the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is different from all the others. It is apocalyptic. And you don't study it like you study Matthew. And you don't study the book of Revelation like you study... Well, as a matter of fact, we don't study Matthew like we study Proverbs. Because we recognize the difference. One is a gospel, one is a biographical sketch of Jesus, one is Proverbs. It's just pithy sayings that are inspired. And so we study them differently. And so when it comes to the book of Revelation, we can't sit down with the book of Revelation and study it like we would the book of Acts. It's different genre. It's a different type of book. And that doesn't mean we can't understand it, but we have to approach it differently. We have to understand as we get into it, it's not teaching us in the way that Matthew teaches us, or the way that Acts teaches us, or the way that the book of Romans teaches us. And so if we recognize the genre going in, really makes it better as we try to understand it. Now, there's some things about apocalyptic literature that we need to understand if we're going to recognize the genre. Apocalyptic literature is a story from God, and it's written in a time of extreme crisis and distress. And it's a book that is given, it's revelation that is given by otherworldly beings, angels. Angels play a big part in apocalyptic literature. An angel told me, an angel did this, an angel did that. That's the type of genre that it is. You don't read about that in say, the book of Romans or the book of Philippians. It's a different kind of book. Both are from God. Both are inspired. But there's a different genre here. And what it does is explain how God is going to reverse everything so that the righteous will be victorious. It looks bad. We have a crisis here. But the angel of God has revealed some things to me that's going to give us hope. And we're going to be victorious. Now, E.S. Russell wrote a book, The Method and Message of Jewish Apocalyptic. Now, he's writing about Zechariah and Daniel and some of these others, but it'd be applicable here. Russell said in talking about apocalyptic literature, it is essentially a literature of the oppressed who saw no hope for the nation, simply in terms of politics or on the plane of human history. The battle they were fighting was on a spiritual level. It was to be understood not in terms of politics or economics, but rather in terms of spiritual powers in high places. And so they were compelled to look beyond the history to the dramatic and miraculous intervention of God, who would set to rights the injustices done to His people. That's what we've got to keep in mind when we study the book of Revelation. It was a dark time in the church's history. Christians were being hauled off and killed. It would be like if we met here, we had to do it sort of in secret, and suddenly during the course of our meeting, the authorities come in and jackbooted us all out and carried a bunch of us off and put us to death. This was a dark time in the history of God's people. And they didn't see any end in sight to the persecution that they were undergoing. John writes this book in which he points out to them, you know, God has taken me up into heaven and He has shown me this is temporary. You're going to be suffering for 5 days. You're going to be going through some real hard times, but God is going to prevail. You hang in there. You hang in there. And so that's just the nature of apocalyptic literature. That's the genre of apocalyptic literature. Now, let's think about some things about apocalyptic literature, and we'll try to make some application here. As indicated a moment ago, it always appears during a time of crises. Always. Daniel and Ezekiel contain some apocalyptic writings, and they were both written during the time of Babylonian captivity in order to comfort the people and prepare them. You're going to have some more trials. Remember this image that Nebuchadnezzar saw and these beasts that Daniel saw? You know what? It's not going to end with Babylon. You're going to have to go through the Medes and the Persians. You're going to have to suffer through the Grecian Empire. And yeah, Rome is that mighty beast coming out of the sea. You've got to be ready for this. And Zechariah was written during the trials and the upheavals of the Persian Empire. And he points to a time when it was going to get better with the Messiah. So keep that thought in mind. I think I'm locked up, Dan. A little arrow come out there. So you keep in mind that apocalyptic literature always appeared during the time of severe persecution. Now, as it was with Babylon, or as it was with Persia, or. And by the way, There are a lot of apocalyptic books written in the period between the Testaments, when the Jewish people were suffering at the hands of the Greeks, during the time of Judas Maccabees and others. But they're not inspired. I'm not suggesting that they are. But nevertheless, they were written during that time period because it was a time of crisis. Secondly, God will act on His people's behalf. That's always important in the book in apocalyptic literature. While it seems that those who war against God's people are being victorious, in the end, God will conquer His foes and His people will gain the victory. Thirdly, apocalyptic literature always speaks to its time. It's not looking down to our time. It always speaks to its time. That's why the Revelation starts, that it shows His servants things which must shortly come to pass. It applies to them. Revelation 22 and verse 6, it concludes with, "Then He said to me, These words are faithful and true. And the Lord God of the holy prophets sent His angel to show His servants the things which must shortly take place." So it's in that time. It always is speaking to its own time. Apocalyptic literature is always highly figurative. He sent and signified it by His angel to His servant John. Signified means to give a sign or to make known by signs. That's what the word signify means. You just take the first four letters of it. You say we're talking about symbolism here. We're talking about signs. You take, for example, in Revelation 1 and verse 16, out of His mouth went a sharp two-edged sword. Did John really see Jesus standing there with a sword protruding from His mouth, much like this picture? Is that what John saw? Is that what John wants people? Signs. He's giving a sign here. What could that be? Huh? Well, His word is sharper than the two-edged sword. Yeah, there's no question about that.
His weapon is like.
But yeah, his weapon is unlike the Romans, the Roman weapon. But what does this suggest? That here is the risen Christ with a sword coming out of His mouth. Now, what good is that going to do against the forces of Rome? What it's doing is it's speaking to the authority of the one speaking. His words are sword. This is the authority of the one speaking. This is what John wants to see. He doesn't want the readers to get wrapped up in all the symbols. The signs say something. And so we got to keep that in mind. When we look at these signs, we got to realize we have to try to understand what is it the signs are representing. The signs or the symbols are the messages. The sign, the symbol is the message. In other words, you don't need necessarily always. You just look at the sign, you get the message. Let me give you, for instance, on this. Here are some things. Does anybody need to explain those signs to us today? I mean, we know when we see those, we immediately recognize what that means. You see, that's what John is doing with apocalyptic literature. He gives a sign, they immediately understand what that sign means. You see, we see an elephant like that, we know, well, that represents the grand old party, the Republicans. You see a donkey, that represents the Democrat Party. You see that symbol over there with the broken upside down cross? We, since the 1960s, have known that's the peace sign. And then the signs that represent the sexes. There, the male and the female. And so that's the way it is in the book of Revelation. These signs are there, and the signs are the message. And that very often is where we get lost. Let me give you a for instance. I was talking to Sue about this. I want you to think about this. During the Civil War between the states, there was a song that was written, and I can't remember who wrote the song, but it was entitled John Brown's Body. John Brown was an abolitionist that was against slavery. And the North needed a song to rally behind. Like the South had Dixie, they rallied behind that. The North needed a song to rally behind. But you know what? It was hard to get people to rally behind the song that says John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. But now, a lady in November of 1961, she took the words of that song, or she took the melody and the music of that song, and she wrote some other words, and her words are apocalyptic. She, in just a few words, had created a vision that the North could rally behind, and we still sing today. And it's to the tune of John Brown's body. Julia Ward Howe wrote, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the faithful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on." That's all symbolism. But you know what? People understood that. They understood that the northern forces were stamping out slavery, and that this was God's wrath being poured out upon this ungodly practice. And so that's all in the world that we're looking at when we look at the book of Revelation. We understand when we read that song that, Jesus didn't come down on earth and stamp out a bunch of grapes. He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He is sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. And all of this is just, it's symbolism. It's apocalyptic. And I'm not saying it's inspired, but I'm saying that's the kind of writing that we're dealing with. That's the genre of the book of Revelation. So we've got to look at it from that regard. To understand apocalyptic literature, let me make you some suggestions here. What I want you to do, as we go through the book, I want you, number one, to visualize the picture. Just let your mind drift over what it is you just read. Now, let's take a moment now and let's read a chapter in the book of Revelation. And on my glasses here, we'll read Revelation 4, because this is after John receives the letters, and he gives the letters to the 7 churches. "After these things I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I heard was like a trumpet speaking to me, saying, Come up here, and I will show you things which must take place after this. Immediately I was in the Spirit. And behold, a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. He who sat there was like jasper and a sardis stone in appearance. And there was a rainbow around the throne in appearance like an emerald. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and on the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting clothed in white robes. And they had crowns of gold on their heads. And from the throne proceeded lightnings, thunderings, and voices. And there were 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. Before the throne there was a sea of glass like crystal, and in the midst of the throne and around the throne were 4 living creatures full of eyes, in front and in back. The first living creature was like a lion, the second living creature like a calf. The third living creature had the face like a man, and the fourth living creature was like a flying eagle. And the 4 living creatures, each having 6 wings, were full of eyes around and within. And they do not rest day or night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. Whenever the living creatures gave thanks and glory, or gave glory and honor and thanks to him who sat on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever, and cast their crowns before him, saying, or before the throne, saying, You are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and by your will they exist and were created. Now when we read something like that, what I want you to do when you study the book of Revelation is just let your mind wander over that or ponder that and just kind of drift over that and visualize it. try to let your mind see the picture that John just wrote about. Just think about it. Just imagine the picture that John just described. He described a magnificent scene. He was taken and given a glimpse of heaven. He was taken and given a glimpse of God sitting on His throne. And John tried to explain the things that he saw, and the grandeur and the glory and the honor of that throne. Then the next thing we need to do is try to grasp the principle. Now, he showed us a picture. He wrote us a picture. What seems to be the message conveyed by the picture of God on His throne? What do you think?
The greatness of God.
Okay, the greatness of God. You see the majesty of God. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? David?
God's to be worshipped.
God
all these heavenly hosts worshiping God.
Which suggests who is not to be worshipped? Man, Rome.
Else?
Yeah. Anything else? Susan?
Well, just in the times of turmoil, they may be doubting whether God's in control of reigning or still wants to reign when it seems like people's reigning in their time and showing that God is on His throne.
Right, exactly. You know, I recall back in Isaiah 6, when the king died, Uzziah died, and it was a very iffy time in the nation's history. But Isaiah saw God on His throne. And that may be what we need to understand from this. Yes, God is to be worshipped. Yes, God is magnificent. But God is in control. He controls the universe. He controls the earth. And He controls human events, not your persecutors. And then thirdly, get the point. What's the message that God is intending for the reader to get? Now, we've just seen God on His throne. We see that He is in control. He is omnipotent. He is worthy of praise, honor, and glory. He is to be worshipped. He's got the human events. God, He hadn't forgotten. He knows what's going on. And so what we need to do now is try to get the message. These suffering Christians, what do they need from this? What's the point they need to get from this? Linda?
Even in the midst of this, God is still a living being who is aware and is working for us.
Right. He's working for you. I haven't forgotten. I'm not like Baal. I'm not off asleep somewhere. I'm well aware of what is occurring here. God, not Rome, is majestic. God is omnipotent, not Rome. And God will prevail, not Rome. And so you see what John is doing? He's setting the groundwork right here for the rest of the book. God is in control. God is magnificent. God is omnipotent. And God will be victorious. I'm pulling the curtain back. I want you to see what is going on behind that. And this is what we need to do. And I just used here a picture from Revelation 12. And Revelation 12 is a very pivotal chapter, coincidentally. It's the chapter where there is a scene in heaven where this woman is pregnant and she's about to deliver a male baby. And there's a seven-headed dragon whose tail is so large that it reaches up into heaven and just swipes the stars out of heaven. And he's waiting to devour that baby. But then he's not successful. He can't devour the baby. So what he does then is he turns his attention toward the saints. The baby survived, but the saints are being killed. And so he said, what we need to do is get a visual of that. We've got to ask, okay, I see the picture. This is a horrible picture that I see here. And now, what's the principle? What is being suggested here? What's the principle? Well, of course, the principle is the devil. The devil has been from the very beginning of time tried to devour and destroy Christ. But he was unsuccessful to do that. He had him put to death, or tried to with the babies, tried to destroy Jesus for having all the babies killed. He failed with that. Had him crucified, but he rose from the dead. He failed with that. And so, he just failed on every account to get rid of the Messiah. And so now he turns his attention to the Christians. And he's trying to devour the Christians, and that's the point that John is trying to make in that chapter. And so when we study it from that perspective, I think it's going to help us a great deal. I got some lesson outlines for Sunday. Tim, Sean, will help me pass this out. This is on verses 1 through 8 from chapter 1. So keep in mind some of the things that we've talked about and try to apply that as we actually now get into the book and try to understand a little bit more about the book as we understand the genre in which it was written. Any questions? Any comments? Jeff Anthony? Oh, sorry. Okay, I hope, I know we spent 3 classes on the background and the introduction, and I hope it's been beneficial to us, to kind of help us understand what it is that we're getting into.